Sam, thanks for sitting down with me today. I'm very excited to talk all things triathlon. But if we pull it back to 2021 then, and the PTO have enjoyed the first real coming out party, if you like. So what were your highlights of last year?
Yes, look, coming out party is a great description. It was the culmination of ultimately 40 years of the sport. Finally, this was the time when the Professional Athletes united. The PTO was formed a few years before then, but obviously, as everyone knows, COVID and a few other things got in our way. And so 2021 was the first year that the athletes could really unite behind the organization and deliver exciting racing in the form of the Collins Cup. I think the moment, specifically actually the opening ceremony of the Collins Cup, because I think that was the point when, it's the right phrase to use, the penny dropped for many of the athletes that were there. You know, this had been talked about for a long time, this concept of bringing athletes together, not just in their teams, but united in one organization. And when the 36 athletes that were chosen were up on that stage in their team gear, I think that was the moment when it really felt different.
You mentioned 40 years there. So it's a young sport. Why is that significant in your opinion?
Yeah, look, it's a really young sport, and I think people forget really when we reference things like the Ryder Cup and other events that we take inspiration for. You've got 50, 60, maybe 100 years of history there of seeing what works. In our case, the Collins Cup, year one, so lots to learn. But look, triathlon is a young sport. It's one of the youngest in the Olympic Games, and it's one of the reasons why it's taken a little bit of time for an organization like the PTO to form. In tennis, it happened in the 80s with the WTA and the ATP, breakaways from the tennis infrastructure at the time. In golf, the PGA Tour was formed in the 1960s. In triathlon, we had our turn in 2020 with sort of the formation of the PTO.
Yeah, and I've listened to your conversations with other people, stakeholders in the triathlon community, and this notion of having athlete buy-in. Why is that important over the organisations taking control or a regulatory body or something like that?
So it's really about buy-in, another word for unity, athletes uniting. That's really the point of difference that we see, not just with the PTO, but in any sport where the athletes have united and they've formed organizations that take their sport forward. We referenced golf and tennis earlier, but there are countless other examples where when the athletes get together, when I say the athletes, I mean the professionals uniting together, they can create something special, because it doesn't matter what sport you're in, we all appreciate the very best, whether it's the very best chess player or tennis player or darts player, and that's been lacking in triathlon. It's been an incredibly fragmented sport. There are only a few times when the very best athletes are frankly incentivized to race each other, and so in uniting with an organization that's behind them that can provide events and opportunities to do exactly that, we can take the sport to a better place.
And I guess there is no sport without the athletes.
Precisely.
So it's got to revolve
exactly.
around them. Well, on the athletes then, was there a standout performer for you in 2021?
It's not necessarily a single performance. Without doubt, you can't talk about the Collins Cup without referencing the battle between Team USA and Team Europe. One that was, to a certain extent, actually unexpected, and that's the great thing about sport. If you could write the results into the beginning, none of us would be here. The way that, in particular, Team USA in the early section of the women's event really pushed, superstar surprise from Taylor Knibb, obviously, that everyone knew about, and then how that played out through the remaining 6 hours is very exciting, as the dominance of Team Europe came back to the fore with the men's racing.
Any upsets that come to mind from 2021? I think you mentioned Taylor Knibb. Was that perhaps an upset for you?
It was certainly a surprise, and I think even for herself and every other athlete there. And one of the benefits of our ranking system, that we were able to spot a talent like Taylor, obviously an athlete that was already competing at a top level at the Olympic distance racing, had a fantastic medal achievement in Tokyo, but then for her to come around then quickly afterwards race in, I think it was Boulder 70.3, that really got her on the map for the captains. We're able to select her and bring it to the event. So certainly I think if anyone you were to ask in say February or even June or July of last year who would be the fastest athlete at the Collins Cup, I don't think anyone would have picked Taylor, and so a real surprise or an upset.
Is that indicative of the standard of triathlon? I'm not trying to hinge that all on Taylor, but do you think 2021 really saw the overall standard of triathlon hit a new high?
Yes, well, what we're seeing is really, and it's partly the distance that we've chosen by design, the 100-kilometer distance is this merging of the two worlds of triathlon. So you've got the short distance specialists, the long distance specialists, traditionally Ironman and challenge races, and the 100-kilometer distance was designed to bring that together with and ultimately crown the ultimate athlete.
What kind of impact have you seen that the Collins Cup has made on the sport?
Well, I think with we're just getting started. That's probably the first thing. As I said before, we reference the Ryder Cup, we reference the Davis Cup and the other competitions. These have had 10, 20, 100 years of history, and we're creating history now with the Collins Cup. So I wouldn't say it's perfect, and we're still learning. That said, the impact I believe it's having is this is beginning to put triathlon on the media pedestal, if that's the right word for it. Right, we're starting to be noticed by television producers, by broadcasters who are recognizing the value in two things. One, the incredible talents of the athletes that we have, but secondly, the incredible value in the audience, which is kind of the underlying thesis of the whole organization, is you've got this incredibly valuable market in triathlon, but it's totally fragmented by the lack of media product. And so that's really probably, if I had to look back and say what was the one thing that was best or most memorable about the Collins Cup, it was our distribution. It was the fact that it was shown live on TV in over 100 markets around the world. And I think even with us, if you wound back 6 months and told us that we would have achieved that, I would have said you're dreaming. And so that was super exciting.
What about the strategy in the lead up though? Because people needed to know that the Collins Cup was coming. And for me, the storytelling that you guys were doing and it was really well produced content getting to the race. And that's what really got me. But did you guys see that was what was almost selling the tickets, if you like?
Yeah, I mean, it's selling the tickets and indeed getting the broadcasters interested. We were able to go and show in advance, like you said, that this isn't just pointing cameras at athletes as they jump into the water, as fantastic as that is. Yeah. This is telling the stories of the talented athletes that are doing that. And the comparison everyone makes is the Olympic Games. These sports that have their time in the sunshine every 4 years, and they have that time in the sunshine not just because people are broadcasters are showcasing the events, but because the broadcasters get under the skin of the athletes. They go and visit them in their homes in the lead up, and they tell the stories of who these incredible people are. And I'm not talking about triathletes now. I mean, take the UK as an example. Every 4 years, we all become obsessed with curling because we learn about the amazing stories of these curlers. And the job of the PTO is to shine that light on professional triathletes, not just once every 4 years, but all year round.
Well, let's talk about the age groupers then. So what changes for them in relation to the Collins Cup?
So age group has always been an important part of our strategy, but a bit like saying that we weren't allowed to have many people with COVID, we weren't allowed to have a broad footprint last year, and so we waited before we added formal age group racing to our events. But moving forward, we will have age group in every single PTO Tour event because we think it's an incredibly important part of the sport. In fact, ultimately, if you peel the onion back and look at what is different between triathlon and golf and tennis, it's the fact that as an amateur fan, I can watch the very best in the world and then rock up to the start line and compete. That'll never happen in golf or tennis, right? Or Formula One. You're not going to see people go-karting around Silverstone anytime soon, at least I assume not. So that's something really special about triathlon that we wanted to embrace and celebrate. We think will be really exciting. And so bringing age groupers alongside the professionals is going to be a big part of what we do moving forward.
Great stuff. Now more of a tricky line of questioning. It was contentious, if you like, and it's all about the rankings.
Okay.
So can you explain how you guys at the PTO actually come up with the rankings?
As a concept, the rankings were important because we recognized there wasn't really a way, at least currently, to be able to know who the very best in our sport is or are. It's a construct of how fragmented the sport of triathlon is at the moment, right? And by that I mean you've got many races. The sport has grown astronomically over the last 10 or 20 years, but it's been fragmented in that the professional fields don't really get together very often, and that's mainly a subject of economics. As we said, there isn't enough prize money that really justifies, if I'm world number 2 and I know that world number 5 is racing, if we were racing for $5,000 or $6,000, I'd rather go and find another race and win that than compete necessarily. And that's not to say that going head to head isn't very important, especially at the very top. Athletes want to compete the best. It's not all about economics, but you've got to pay a mortgage at the end of the day, and so it's important that there is the just rewards for the effort, and that's really important to us as a philosophy. So with a fragmented sport, we wanted to come up with a way that we could rank athletes really for 2 reasons. One, it's probably the most important thing in any sport to know who's the best, right? That's what we talk about all day long, whether it's in a pub with friends and training. Do you agree with who's best? Do you disagree? And then secondly, perhaps more importantly, the economics themselves. We fundamentally believe triathletes aren't paid, professional triathletes, I should say, are not paid as much as they deserve. And this is our mechanism that we can begin to fix that. So we have a $2 million prize purse for the rankings that's paid out at the end of the year. And then thirdly, but last and not least, it's also the selection process for the Collins Cup teams. So we have this interesting dynamic where we've created team internationals as a concept, as you know, alongside Team USA and Team Europe. And we use the rankings to determine who will make it to the honor, frankly, of being in their team.
Did you predict that there would be so much conversation going on around the rankings, how they worked, and their meaning as well?
Definitely. It's
a good thing, right?
It's a good thing, yeah. I mean, and every sport will always have that. When you're beginning to show one versus another, that's already a point of contention. When you add in the fuel of $2 million of prize money behind it, it gets really contentious, and we love that. And I think most would argue that the output also shows it, whether it's Gustav and Laura being first, whether it's Jan and Daniela being close up there, but maybe not quite as high up because they haven't been racing as much. I don't think anyone would argue with the output of how we're ranking those athletes.
Do you think that encourages athletes to get out in the field more consistently rather than having like an A race where they're all invested? I mean, I know these guys do more than that, but rather than heading for that one big performance, you're now almost encouraging them to have multiple big performances.
Yes, I suppose. Well, multiple, I guess. Three is the number, right, in triathlon, whether it's for the rankings and anything else. The difference, I think, what it allows is that if an athlete is having a great day, they can know that they can really push to the end and get a high score, regardless of who they're competing with or where it is in the cycle. And that's been really important, again, when it's been fragmented, but also when it's been so regionalized. It's also helped, and it's sort of one area which I think people underlook, is it allows us to showcase athletes that are further down that might be racing in a regional area, an event that doesn't have any media coverage, but if it's got the conditions that are within the ranking, so it's got a professional field that has the adequate prize money, we can showcase an athlete that really sort of rises up. And if you go back 3 or 4 years now, Sam Long is the perfect example of that, and as an athlete that I think was ranked 45th, maybe 50th, in the world. Pretty low down in the sense of things compared to where he is now. And with the rankings, we've been able to show his journey over the last couple of years.
And he's certainly been able to show his journey as well. He does
has.
a really good job of marketing himself. From 2021 then to 2022, is there something that you're looking forward to seeing that perhaps was left unsaid or undone as we move into this new season?
Team Europe remains the dominant force, but as we've seen even lately with the up-and-coming athletes coming through and racing around Challenge and Ironman events, there's all to play for this year. So I think it's certainly not a foregone conclusion. And then on a more organizational perspective, this is the first year of the PTO Tour. So we're excited to grow beyond the Collins Cup and create, as I said before, this sort of season-long narrative with our events in Canada and in the US.
I've seen the sort of theme of rivalries within triathlon, which was not something that I think was necessarily spoken about too much outside, but it's really something that I feel you guys have magnified a little bit. And we've now seen a few of those things pop, which have gained those column inches.
Yep.
I guess that was something that you guys went after, and perhaps if it was, why did you think that was an important thing to highlight?
So rivalries are integral to all sports, right? I mean, sport is gladiatorial. It's one person versus another, or it's a team versus team. So they're always going to exist, whether we fan the flames or not. I think the really interesting dynamic around triathlon is that incredible rivalries have existed for 40 years. If you go back to Mark Allen and Dave Scott, or Norman Stadler and Chris McCormack, the difference is there wasn't any media platform promoting those rivalries. Like, they existed on the race course, but a bit like a tree that falls in the wood and no one hears it, does the tree ever fall? The rivalries were never showcased, they were never seen. And that's really where we've been trying to fix that. We're investing in media and storytelling and content creation around the athletes, because we fundamentally believe these guys and girls are some of the greatest athletes on the planet. They've got some of the fantastic rivalries on the planet, and we should showcase that to everybody. Can you give me one from the men and one from the women? The two rivalries that perhaps we should all be keeping an eye on in 2022? I think, look, this is going to be such an interesting year. There are so many different dynamics around it. Whether it's, you've got Jan Frodeno still at the top of his prime, after years, frankly, undefeated. You've got the rise of the Norwegian athletes with Gustav and Christian. But then you've also got the dark horse of Alistair Brownlee's return from an injury a couple of years, and the rivalry between Jan and Alistair is well documented. So it's going to be an incredible year on the men's side, and equally strong on the women's. Whether it's Lucy Charles, who's consistently been getting closer and closer, and of course won her first World Championships last year. Daniela on the top of her game, but potentially the one that everyone's going after, and then not to miss out someone like Laura Phillip, who's shown so much consistency the last 6 months.
Is there an athlete, out of the ones that you just mentioned, as we look into 2022, like maybe personally, is there someone that you're really excited to see who can either keep hold of the mantle maybe, or someone that's maybe changing the game in some way?
I think to me it's less a specific athlete as much as the question of the short course and the long guys going together.
Okay.
And that's really what we're going to see, whether it's Taylor Knibb in the women, who I didn't mention before, or Gustav and Christian in the men's. It's, can the long course guard maintain that dominance? Because this is an endurance sport after all, and in the event showed it. Or will the short course athletes that are stepping up take the crown?
So from your experience then, and perhaps some of the uninitiated with this, like what is that about? Because I'm fast twitch endurance. That's
Sure.
in a very simple way of dressing it down, but please layer that for us and why it's such an interesting dynamic.
Yeah, so the 100-kilometer distance, which we created with the Collins Cup, we had it in Daytona at the PTO 2020 Championships, and we're going to have at the 2 PTO Tour events we have this year, consists of a 2-kilometer swim, 80-kilometer bike, and an 18-kilometer runner. It's designed that we think it's a distance that can really crown the ultimate athlete, because you can go really, really hard if you're only running. I say only running 18 kilometers. You can go at a pace that's faster than if you've got to maintain that for 42. Which maybe sound obvious, but it's not until you see the athletes really race and their shift in their speed that you see that. So to us, the 100-kilometer really crowns the ultimate athlete. It's endurance, it's skill, and it's speed.
What's on the line this year?
Well, $5.5 million to start, which is pretty exciting.
Handsome.
Yeah, pretty exciting prize purse, and that'll only go up as we add the events. But it's also the pride of winning events that I think people are beginning to see will really showcase talents. Right, there are both the PTO Tour events in Canada and the US are going to be shown live around the world. We've got some incredible broadcast windows that we'll announce soon. These events will be watched by millions, so it's not just for the athletes to get across and win that winning check. It's also the pride and the prestige and the kudos of being, the champion of the US Open.
So then the big stuff, that number one prize, if you like, at the end of 2022, what do you think it's going to take from the athletes to, reach that dizzy height?
Probably in a word, consistency, right? This is going to really reward it. That's one of the benefits of both a ranking system and a season-long narrative, is that we don't see the person that performs fantastically well on one day in October being treated as the greatest athlete in the sport, because we just frankly don't believe that. Like if the greatest tennis player in the world was the person that played at Roland Garros every year, the world would never have heard of Roger Federer. What
do you think that might look like at that top 5 of the rankings as we count through the months towards the end of the year?
Well, we've got, you need a crystal ball to answer that question this year. Yeah, well, especially this year.
Do you think it's going to move around a lot, though?
I think so, yeah, partly because, if we talk about the dynamics of the sport, I said beforehand, before the PTO came along and invested in this way, really triathlon only had its time in the sunshine once every 4 years, so the Olympics. Now, post-Olympics, there's this whole other dynamic of our racing. And so coming off the back of Tokyo, you've got these incredibly talented, mainly often younger, short course athletes that are going to step up. Many of them haven't, though, been through the real trials and tribulations of this level of racing at this distance. They might have done a 70.3 here or there and done well, but doing that alongside Lionel Sanders, alongside Jan Frodeno, alongside Alistair Brownlee at the top of their game, it's a very different dynamic when you're racing. So I don't think it's necessarily a foregone conclusion that the short course athlete's going to come in and dominate. But that said, the racing will tell us, and there's a whole host of new athletes coming onto the scene, which makes it exciting.
Yeah, I like the kind of veteranship to this, because it clearly exists. And how difficult is it to strategize over a long course race as opposed to the shorter sprint distances and Olympic distance?
Yeah, it's a very, very different dynamic. In the mixed relay or the short distance, the race can be lost in a second because of something going wrong. In contrast, it's a long game, right? In long distance racing, it's about consistency, it's about staying measured, it's about driving right to the finish line. And that takes a different kind of, I wouldn't say skill set, it takes a different kind of experience level. And that's perhaps why we're seeing some of our older athletes continue to perform so well. You can't bet against the experience that someone like a Jan Frodeno and Lionel Sanders have had over 7, 8, 10, 20 years of racing. Not to miss out Alistair Brownlee, who's been on top of his game since he was about 9 years old.
Yeah. I want to go a little bit deeper with some storylines, though. So
Sure.
you've spoken about Jan and Daniela, the kind of greatest of all time, both sides of the coin there. But there are other athletes now that we're all getting to know a lot more about, and social media is a wonderful tool to really let us in and give us a lens into how their days look. Are there a couple of athletes or particular storylines that you're excited to see develop as we go into this new season?
Yeah, so look, the women's racing in particular is wide open because you've got so many different talents coming to the fore, whether it's Lucy Charles, obviously she's recently announced she's had some injury problems over the season.
That really shakes things up.
Changes the dynamic with Lucy about how quickly she can come back. She was absolutely top of her game. So although very personally disappointing for her to go through it, this is professional sport. This is what happens when you're pushing that hard. So it'll be a question of how quickly can Lucy get back to the fore. Daniela, you touched on already. She's been so dominant, and you really can't count out the experience of a champion like that. They might have some tough days. They might go for a bad period. Again, injury playing into it. But it's very hard to ride against a champion. Or it's the other athletes that are rising up. Taylor Knibb, we've touched on. Sky Munch has risen up the rankings. Holly Lawrence continuing to perform really well. And that's a handful of 5 of the 12 athletes that we'll see, at least from the women at the Collins Cup.
It's a very individual sport, of course, apart from when we get into the team environment, which was, of course, a wonderful addition. But how much do these athletes need one another? Like, how much do they need Lucy to be in the field in order to achieve the very best versions of themselves?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, look, there's such an interesting dynamic around individual competition. As you say, this is an individual sport. This is about pushing to the max for hours and hours. And with the PTO and our focus on television, there's no longer a place to hide, right? So it used to be that you might stalk in the back of the field and then come into the last hour or two and suddenly everyone sees you there. But with our approach, we've got cameras everywhere. We know what's going on, right? And so it kind of changes the dynamic there. And look, depending on who you are as an athlete, some thrive off the rivalry of having someone right there. They're real fighters, like Christian Blumenfeld's a perfect example of someone. You see him racing in the Tokyo Games, right up to the line. It was as much a psychological win as it was a physiological win. Whereas you've got other athletes that the gun goes off, their head down, and they go off, and it's catch me if you can. Very different dynamic. One of the exciting things about the sport is there is that so much variety.
The Collins Cup, then, can Team Europe be beaten?
Can they be beaten? Of course. I mean, it goes without saying. At some point, Team Europe will be beaten, and will be very interesting in particular to see over the coming years what happens with Team US. In particular, because NCAA collegiate status has just been awarded, that generally causes a huge lift in funding and support, and indeed prestige for triathlon. For any sport that goes through collegiate status. And so I think anyone in the performance structure around the world is kind of looking at the US now almost with a sense of foreboding about what will this mean, like how many more talented athletes will come into the place. But then, you can't count out team internationals. You've got some really plucky underdogs, probably is the phrase you would use to describe, athletes from different countries, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. They're used to being smaller countries taking on US, and you unite those kind of underdogs all together. It's a powerful thing, and I think we'll see that, if not this year, then certainly in the years ahead.
I'd like to discuss the dynamic of the short course versus the long course, and obviously with reference to the PTO Tour. So have there been any athletes of note that have come from short course racing that have really done well over the longer distance?
Well, yeah, if you go back the last 10 years and you look at most of the athletes that are now racing at the top of their game at long course, they came from short course racing, but perhaps just a longer period than any of us might remember. Jan Frodeno was part of the German development program, won the Olympic Games, obviously in Beijing. Alistair Brownlee, an example of an athlete who hasn't maybe cracked the top level of long course racing yet, but arguably one of the greatest athletes of all time in the short course. So it's traditionally been or long course racing has traditionally been a time when athletes who are older are moving across. And I think the interesting dynamic we have now is you've got youngsters that are stepping right up, like athletes like Gustav Iden and Christian Blumenfeld, still absolutely in their prime of their short course racing career, but choosing to step up and take on the very best long course athletes over the 100-kilometer distance. So I think the question on everyone's lips this year is, do we see this changing of the guard? Do we see Jan Frodeno and Daniela Renouf, no longer at the top? Will these youngsters come up and push them off?
They feel like different energy systems. So do these athletes have to, at some point very soon, have to make a choice? Like, where is my future? And how do you think the PTO might influence that decision?
Well, part of the reason we have the 100-kilometer distance is hopefully to not have to make that choice. We believe that it's short enough that the short course athletes can step up and race, and equally the long course athletes can step down and race in a format that's designed to make it exciting for TV.
Are there any young athletes that are short course athletes that are coming through now that you're excited to see?
I mean, you can't talk about short course athletes stepping up and not mention Gustav Iden. Phenomenal athlete. What he did at the PTO 2020 Championships in Daytona. Frankly, as he said, he almost made it look easy. He had a phenomenal race at the Collins Cup, then stepped down distance to go to the Olympic Games again, and now coming back and racing long course. So Gustav, an example of now one of the top ranked athletes in the world, and really showcasing how you can step up. But equally, it works the other way around. It's not all about the youngsters stepping up. You take an athlete like Nicola Spirig, who's doing sub 8 this year. Nicola has been one of the most consistent athletes over the last 20 years, nearly 25 years, I think, of racing. And so will we see her dominance come to the fore over the 100-kilometer distance? It's exciting to see.
So it brings me to the changing of the guard, if you like. This is an exciting period. Can we still see, however, some of the more established names in long course triathlon hold on to those top spots, or are they going to be heavily challenged this year?
I think without doubt there's going to be challenging racing, but you be a brave man to bet against the talents of Jan Frodeno, right? He is one of the most consistent, dominant professional athletes of our age. There's a lot of talk about whether is Jan Frodeno's time up, but you'd have to be either a very brave or very foolish man to bet against the consistency of Jan. Look at his professionalism the last 10, 20 years, his consistency. I certainly don't have the guts to make that bet. I think it's going to be such an exciting dynamic. As we said, we called it changing of the guard. You really can't predict when that guard is going to get changed. It's inevitable at some point. Age catches up with everybody, but will this be the year that some of the older athletes begin to see the youngsters come through, or will they turn right round with their experience and their maturity and show the youngsters who's boss? I couldn't predict it, but it's going to be exciting to see.
Sam, thank you very much for sitting down with us today. Really enjoyed this one.
My pleasure. Yeah, look forward to a great season.